This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 795 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. This 10 Trend Show is the quickest, simplest show of the week. I talk about 10 data-related trends that might help you make better decisions for your fantasy football team. It's that simple. There's really no more explanation needed. Now, before getting into those trends this week, I just want to let you know that with the season about to get underway, yes, the late round draft guide, not as relevant anymore. But I've got a Patreon too. The Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon has weekly in-season rankings, rest of season rankings, live stream Q&As with yours truly, and more. You can find the Patreon by simply going to lateround.com. Now let's get to some trends. Now, clearly the trends this week aren't based off of the 2023 season because the 2023 season hasn't started yet. But I still think that some of these are going to be interesting and helpful. Trend 1 this week is that the Steelers had just 12 passing touchdowns last year versus 16 rushing touchdowns. Only 13 teams since 2011 failed to get 13 passing touchdowns. Pittsburgh's one of those teams. But that type of scoring ratio usually does not maintain. Teams who have more rushing touchdowns than passing touchdowns tend to regress to a mean where they start throwing for more of their touchdowns. In fact, of the 22 teams with a pass-to-rush touchdown rate below 50% since 2011, so the 22 teams with next season data who had more rushing touchdowns than passing touchdowns, the average increase in rate the following year, 6.5%. We should expect the Steelers to have more passing touchdowns in 2023. Not only because the offense should just be better in general, but the way they score their touchdowns should skew more towards the pass than it did in 2022. With Cooper Kupp banged up, the Rams don't have a whole lot going for them at wide receiver. I like Puka Nacua as a potential rookie breakout this year. Maybe I should have added him to the 15 transactions episode. But let's not pretend that this is a position that they're deep at without Kupp. That could lead to a lot of looks for Tyler Higbee. Don't forget that last season, Higbee hit a career-high 20.4% target share per game rate. Only Mark Andrews, Kyle Pitts, Travis Kelce, and TJ Hawkinson had a better rate than that. Don't be surprised if Tyler Higbee ends up being an extremely safe option, not just across the entire season, but specifically here when Cooper Kupp might be sidelined. This next trend is actually one that was posted to the Late Round Fantasy Football Instagram last week. You can go follow that Instagram account at LateRoundFF. I haven't talked a lot about Trey Palmer on the show. I did during draft season a little bit, but not really over the summer. But my prospect model liked him. And I think that I should call that out. He broke out late and he didn't have amazing draft capital. It's not like he's some obvious breakout candidate. But he had a 3.06 best season yards per team pass attempt rate, which is predictive. And he had a 52.9% best season touchdown share. He's the only wide receiver in this year's class to hit a yards per team pass attempt of 3 to go along with a touchdown share of 50% or better. He's going to get some opportunity in this Buccaneers offense. He doesn't necessarily need to be on your roster right now today, at least in normal leagues. In deeper leagues, yeah, you should throw that dart. But he definitely is someone to be ready to jump on if the usage looks right early on. FantasyLife.com has some cool data tools that I'm going to be utilizing for this 10 Trends episode throughout the season. One of them is a game script one that looks at how pass-heavy teams are within certain scoring parameters. And this ties into the last trend that I just talked about with Trey Palmer. The Buccaneers have been really pass-heavy over the last few years with Tom Brady. In fact, their overall pass rate, they've ranked first, and third. But something interesting on Fantasy Life was that when the team was trailing by 9 to 16 points last year, they not only had the highest pass rate in football compared to other teams when they were in those situations, but it was the highest by a lot. It was almost 90% when the team in second, the Chargers, were at about 77.5%. Tom Brady not being there means that number is almost definitely going to drop here in 2023. We could see a pretty big shift in overall pass volume in this Buccaneers offense, even when you consider the fact that they could be facing a lot of negative game scripts. Think of it this way. Over the last 2 seasons, the Bucs have seen 751 and 731 pass attempts. Let's average that out to 740. The average NFL team, the team who ranks 16th in pass attempts over the last 2 seasons, they've been at 571 pass attempts. That means that if the Bucs are roughly average this season in pass attempts, which could be realistic, then we're looking at a drop of 169 pass attempts year over year. That could have a really big impact on the players there. There was an article from The Athletic this week where beat writers from each team gave a fantasy football tidbit. For the Texans, it was about Dameon Pierce in that backfield. Mike Jones wrote the following. He, meaning Pierce, should still start, and the Texans would be smart to use a steady dose of the run to ease pressure on rookie C.J. Stroud. However, with it appearing as if Houston plans on going with a platoon, Pierce as your top back may be unwise. Second back, sure thing. So Jones is essentially saying here that despite the preseason usage, which looked great for Dameon Pierce, we could see a platoon in Houston this year with Devin Singletary. And I think Singletary will be involved. Platoons exist in almost every NFL backfield these days. The big question mark is with Pierce's receiving usage, because if that's not there, it could be a rough season for him fantasy-wise. Last year, Pierce finished with just a 9% target share per game rate. And that backfield had less competition than this year's backfield. He only had 4 games above a 10% target share. That's the thing that's going to unlock Dameon Pierce this year. I'm not overly bullish that he's going to get to like a 15% target share. But I do think the competition is still weak enough at receiver out of the backfield to where he could get to that 10% mark. I'm just not sure that in an offense with a rookie quarterback, if that's going to cut it for him to truly make a jump into being an RB1 in fantasy. So Pierce, to me, he's going to be a solid piece for you this year. But like a lot of dead zone running backs, the consistent upside is worrisome. Speaking of rookie quarterbacks, I did episodes on how rookie quarterbacks aren't good for the skill players on their team for fantasy purposes. Largely because teams with rookie quarterbacks are number 1, more run heavy than the average team, but number 2, they just don't score that many touchdowns. Anthony Richardson, he's a rookie quarterback. So the pass catchers on that team are going to take a hit compared to a team with a decent veteran. With that being said, I don't know if people realize how bad the Colts offense was last year. They became just the 15th team since 2011 to score fewer than 1.5 touchdowns per game. Now, fortunately, the average increase in touchdowns per game year over year for those teams has been 0.6. So we could see over half a touchdown more per game for the Colts this year, which across 17 games could end up being 10 or more touchdowns. That's not nothing. The Colts also scored a touchdown on every 229 offensive yards. That was the 8th highest value over the last 12 years. Meaning they were getting a lot of yards and they weren't scoring touchdowns on those yards, when yards correlate to touchdowns. That's also a number that's bound to regress. Basically, Richardson and his mobility and his rookie status, that might not be great for the playmakers in that offense. But keep in mind that this season is probably not going to be worse than it was last season for the Colts offensively. Now, the passing volume might not be there, but the offensive efficiency, the offensive effectiveness, that should be better. Alexander Mattison has been a controversial player all offseason long. I think my Perspectives episode with Sigmund Bloom shed a lot of light on the positives with Mattison. So I'd listen to that episode if you haven't already. Especially if you're down on him. I know that I walked away from that episode with a somewhat different outlook. Now, I've mostly been at market with Mattison this year, recognizing that he does have a lot of the signs of being this standard dead zone running back. But I also think that the community has sometimes gone too far in the opposite direction, basically just to make a stand. So for him in particular, I'm in the middle. Now, with that being said, Mattison has played 11 NFL games where he carried the ball 10 or more times. In those contests, he's averaged a pretty impressive 15.7 PPR points per game. It's not like he's been totally incapable of scoring fantasy points in the past. Again, I'm in the middle here because it's very easy to see both sides. A lot of the stuff that I research says that he's kind of destined to fail. But as Bloom pointed out, there are reasons to still be bullish despite those historical trends. And his performance when getting volume should make you feel at least a little bit more comfortable. A lot of you weren't around during prospect season, so I want to talk a little bit about Jahmyr Gibbs. Jahmyr Gibbs, the prospect. It's true that running back weight matters. I mentioned that with Devon Achane on yesterday's show. And Gibbs does not have an insane amount of size. Now, I'm not looking at this from the perspective of he didn't weigh over 200 pounds, therefore he's going to be bad. Really, what we've historically seen is that around 210 pounds, that's where good fantasy backs have come from. But everything works together. We shouldn't look at this stuff in such a binary way. There are good and bad to each prospect. The fortunate thing with Gibbs is that his draft capital tells us that he's not like the standard smaller running back. He's different. In fact, when he got selected in round 1, he became just the third running back since 2011 to get selected in the first round with a best season reception share above 17%. You know who the other two backs were? Oh, these guys named Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley. After going as high as he did, Gibbs immediately then comped more favorably to a Christian McCaffrey type than a Giovanni Bernard type. I'm ready for him to catch a ton of passes here in 2023. Trend 9 is that in 2022, teams averaged just 2.27 offensive touchdowns per game. That was the lowest mark that we'd seen since 2017. And it likely had to do with the gap that we saw in quarterback play, which led to what we saw in quarterback scoring in fantasy. The elite quarterbacks like Mahomes, Allen, and Hurts really separated themselves. And not only did they do that because they were playing well, but the mid-tier QB1s were just flat out bad last year. We saw the biggest delta between the top 3 quarterbacks to the rest of the position that we've seen since at least 2011. Now, I did an episode earlier this offseason on the rise of the early round quarterback. And as I said on that show, episode 772, there are some formats and league types where I'd get one of the big 3 this year. But I do expect regression to hit, not only with the top 3 quarterbacks, but with the rest of the position. And that's going to have a domino effect. More touchdowns could end up being scored, and that's going to bring more fantasy relevancy to players across the league. The quarterback position has that kind of impact. The last trend this week is really just about my fantasy football philosophy. I've talked a lot this offseason about buying into talent and letting the situational pieces just sort of fall into place. I think Drake London is the perfect example of that. I'm going to use a snippet of the late round draft guide for this trend. With Drake London, I wrote, he's currently getting drafted as a low-end wide receiver 2, around wide receiver 22 or wide receiver 23. Since 2011, we've seen 25 second-year wide receivers get drafted as wide receiver 13 to wide receiver 30 while playing 8 games that season. That's wide receiver 2 to middle-of-the-road wide receiver 3 range. Of those 25, there were 4 who had a rookie season yards per route run rate, so their previous season, above 2.0. Each of those players ended up playing at least 2.7 PPR points per game above ADP expectation. They were almost all moderate breakouts. Drake London will join that group this season. How about this? Among those 25 second-year wide receivers, 10 had a target share per game rate of 20% or more during their previous season, their rookie year. Only 2 of those players, 20% of them, played below expectation. 6 of them were moderate breakouts, which is when a player plays 3 or more PPR points per game above expectation. Drake London will join that group this season. There are so many things pointing to Drake London being a really good player and pointing to him being a good bet at ADP. Maybe the situation does end up screwing him, which is entirely possible, but I want to bet on players who I think might end up being elite. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly Sleeper Show.